Bill Strauss from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and very happy to be back at Teton Springs and joining the Rocky Mountain Economic Summit. We're going to cover three different topics, manufacturing, and really from the Chicago Fed, we have the states of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and what makes our district unique is in part manufacturing as well as agriculture, but we've got an ag economist. He's not here today, so I'm going to talk about manufacturing, which is what I tend to focus on. A couple of things I want to get across first is with these main key points. Number one, I think with regard to where we're going in manufacturing, I think there's some good news there. The good news is the fact that growth is still expected to occur over the next year or two. And in particular, I think we're kind of setting the stage for an investment cycle that can be quite positive for the economy as we move forward. So that's one of the key takeaways. This is in light of the fact I want to, at the end of my presentation, the second half of it, I want to focus on the automotive sector because that's probably of the manufacturing, the one that kind of let us out, was doing great year after year after year, but right now appears to be downshifting. And we haven't yet settled to exactly a level that people I think would be comfortable saying we're at this new norm with regard to sales. I'm optimistic that it's not going to be anything major of a downshift, but that being said, it's not going to be a positive contribution to growth for manufacturing as we see fewer sales taking place. That being said, growth is still expected. So where is the rest of that growth going to come from? That's what I want to kind of focus on. So I'm going to talk around some of the points that were made earlier today. We are now in the 9th year of our economic expansion. So starting this month, we are now in that 9th year. Historically, since the Great Depression, World War II period, we've seen economic expansions that have lasted 5 years. But as Chair Yellen in her testimony talked about, expansions do not just die of old age. They don't run out of steam. There is nothing any of us as speakers that you're going to hear that's going to encourage any of you to go back to your offices, your homes, put your feet up on your desks and say, I made enough money. I could just chill. That's not how our system works, right? We always want to grow. We want to do better for ourselves, our family, and our businesses and employees. So the natural state is growth. In the U.S., that growth is regarded as something around 2% or just under 2%. The latest summary of economic projections from the Federal Market Committee suggests that that's about a 1.8 to 2% trend growth rate for our economy. That number comes about by the two ways that economies can grow, one of which is labor force growth. And certainly with an aging population, our labor force growth is on the weaker side, although quite positive relative to many other developed economies, as well as emerging economies such as China, which is experiencing some much slower growth on that because of the one child per household. That being said, it's about 0.8%. That generates about 1 million jobs a year for our economy under a normal growing period. So the other way you grow is to just doing things more efficiently, more effectively, what we call productivity, and that is something that we regard as being around 1 to 1.25% in a medium term, say in the next 5-year kind of look. You can add those two growth rates together, and that's roughly how you come up with that 1.8 to 2% growth. So what we've seen since the middle of 2009, so now for 8 years basically, is that the economy is growing at 2.1% annualized growth rate, which is what we matched over the past 4 quarters, first quarter over first quarter. So it's been decent growth. I've kind of referred to it as the tortoise economy. It's kind of moderate and steady performance, but not exceptional. It's just barely over what we think of as trend. And that's why even in the 9th year of our expansion, it's really hard to find any real sector of the economy that appears to be too far ahead of itself, too overheated, that we need to see a major adjustment in. One of the indicators that I think is quite valuable, so here we are in the 3rd quarter, we don't even know what second quarter GDP is, and we won't know that for several more weeks until the end of July. But we have an indicator that we put together at the Chicago Fed known as a National Activity Index. And it's an indicator which gives us a sense of how the economy is doing relative to that trend. So that's that black line going across the screen at 0. When our indicator is at 0, it means that we're growing near this trend rate of growth. And in fact, the most recent reading, which is May, so we have 2 out of the 3 months already reported for the second quarter, has us basically at 0. So suggesting that the growth of the economy is still positive, still growing, but not impressively. And in fact, the current nowcasting that's out there currently has it at around 2.5% for the second quarter. We'll have to see what finally materializes in a few weeks. But nonetheless, it kind of coincides with that. In addition, we're far removed from the roughly minus 0.7 to the minus 1.3 that we tend to worry about with regard to a potential recession. So the good news is we are far away from that point. Again, it would require some kind of a negative economic shock to kind of tip us into that. So I mentioned about growing the economy. The labor market has been phenomenal. By any measure, unemployment rates are very low from a historical standpoint. We can have a discussion about whether they're at the natural rate or not. Nonetheless, I think when your population and labor force is growing by this roughly 1 million jobs a year, and we added 2.2 million over the past 12 months, that's pretty impressive. In fact, it's so impressive that you begin to question how long can that continue, right? Because even being so productive, in the U.S., it still takes 16 years and 9 months to make a worker. So if we want workers, it takes a long time to get them ready. And the other aspect is you can have immigration, which, by the way, half of our labor force growth is immigration. We could open up our borders and bring in a lot more people, but under the current administration, I think it's a less likely thing. So the point is that we have been seeing employment growth that has been quite spectacular and, in fact, more than double the long-run trend. So when you talk about an economy growing at this just over 2%, if your labor force is growing at and employment is growing at 1.6%, you don't need a lot more to get that extra 0.5% of output. And so you don't need to do a tremendous amount of investment. And I think that has been a key part of what's been going on, is that, as we've heard, labor is inexpensive. And when faced with how do I expand to grow the business, you could hire more workers, add a few shifts. People are doing that. And if you happen to go into a recession, you can shed those workers with our flexible labor market, and you're not saddled with the cost compared with a piece of machinery which would be sitting idle and getting less valuable, given so much of it is now more high tech. So when you look at what's going on with productivity, it's been abysmal. That 1 to 1.25% that we talk about, we haven't achieved half of that growth, basically. And I think in large part, the explanatory factor for that is that we have not been investing for the reasons that I just mentioned. We've been using labor relative to capital. But I think that inexpensive labor story is starting to come to an end. We are getting nascent signs of wages starting to move higher. I do believe that with the unemployment rate as low as it is, and looking at the demographics of our workforce, it's going to be hard to sustain that 2+ million job creation much longer. And in fact, I think that's what's going to be the linkage, is as businesses find it more difficult to get those workers, they're going to be paying more dearly to obtain those workers, which will make the capital to labor comparison more favorable towards capital. In addition, as you can see, the capital spend has been so low, and given again how much more high-tech the capital side is becoming, you've missed a generation, that kind of 2 to 3 year window of new stuff that comes into the market that really makes it quite attractive. So in fact, we know the first quarter GDP was a pretty poor number at well less than 2%. Yet look at what happened in the first quarter for investment. It soared. And in fact, that's going to be my first number that I will be looking at come the release of the second quarter data to see whether or not we're seeing that continuation of the investment side. It's very volatile, as you can see, but again, I think there are things in train that could help support that. I'm going to move these a little quickly because I want to get to the auto side. But this is just showing you during the Great Recession, December of 2007 to June of 2009, manufacturing fell by over 20%. Now, the overall economy fell by over 4% in GDP terms. So this was far deeper, but that's not unusual. It's a durable goods side. It tends to be more volatile. And the point of this chart is also highlighting that it was very broad. All sectors got hit pretty hard. The one that stands out, I know it's hard to see, that really far bar, that's autos. And autos fell quite dramatically. But like the tennis ball, subsequent, you can make a guess, what is the one that's really standing out on the far right side? That's the auto side, which has been the key driver for the manufacturing sector, which, by the way, still has not recovered all of its losses that took place during the Great Recession. So in terms of this cycle that we're in, I talk about the slack that's out there, even the manufacturing sector is still not quite there. It was getting close to getting there until several years ago when the surging value of our currency basically made manufacturers much more challenged because it was much more difficult to sell their products to foreign customers with the higher value of the currency, and it made imported products much more inexpensive to domestic people to purchase, so you had to compete against that. Did it cause the manufacturing sector to collapse? No. But whatever growth was occurring stopped. So we had a couple of years of basically no growth in the manufacturing sector on top line. The one that continued was automotive. That was really the only bright spot. The other thing that was kind of hurting it was the energy sector, which, of course, when we saw the collapse there. This kind of summarizes one of the points that was made in that really super panel we had this morning, talking about the world view. This is the purchasing managers' indexes from around the world. The top line is the globe. The second grouping is North America, and then the middle grouping is Europe, and the bottom grouping is Asia. Brazil's at the very, very bottom. But what you can see, going back, the far right is the most recent month, and then it goes back a year, that we have a lot more green and a lot less yellow than what we had a year ago. The point is that we're seeing activity that is improved all around the world. As we heard, it's not just an expectation of better growth in the U.S., it's better growth around the world. But I think we again have to keep in mind that better growth, if you look at many of these forecasts that are out there, is for improved growth, but not spectacularly improved. It's just doing a bit better. So let me just throw this in there. So manufacturing employment. We've added jobs over the past year, but because manufacturing, if anything, is so productivity driven, it's just been 49,000 jobs have been added over the past year. This is not going to be the source of great employment gains that you sometimes hear of, politicians often highlight. But it's again productivity. Capacity utilization has been improving. You can kind of see it just beginning to edge a bit higher, again suggesting that we're seeing improved conditions there. The Purchasing Managers Index for the U.S. remains at all in all quite decent levels. So again, even with the automotive slowdown that I alluded to, we're seeing good numbers on the purchasing managers. This is for your own use later on. This is a heat chart showing industry by industry how we're doing over the past 5 years. And on the far right, mainly you can see there's a lot more green on that top line, which is the total industrial production, than what we've seen in the past couple of years. So the sense that things are beginning to get a bit better. So before I move on to autos, just to close off, this is the blue chip economic forecast for for industrial production. And what they have is basically growth occurring this year and next year, but growth that is lower than a trend, but still above 2% in both years. So this is, again, a decent, but certainly improved from the no growth that we've seen for the last couple of years, but not setting the world on fire. But it is going to be feeling better. So the automotive side. You can see the collapse that happened with regard to vehicle sales during the Great Recession, falling to levels that we hadn't seen since the 1960s. Things came roaring back, right? And it's hard not to roar back from those kind of levels. But we began to run out of steam. In fact, we set a record for vehicle sales back in 2015. The industry was expected to remain flat, if not down, in 2016, but in fact, they pushed things and edged it a bit higher. And in part, maybe that's what we're experiencing in 2017, is they pulled some of those sales into 2016. But nonetheless, we saw just an edging higher, 0.4%, setting a new record for vehicle sales in 2016. That being said, year to date, we see sales that are, for the first 6 months of the year, 1.3% lower. But talk about a bifurcation of the industry. Depends upon what you are producing. We talked about a couple of sessions with regard to energy and how that is doing. I think this is a great measurement to really reflect what's happening. This is the energy spend by consumers on energy goods and services. So this includes filling up your Range Rovers. It includes, paying your electric bills, your heating bills. And what you can see is that going back to 1960, it is really low right now, just about 4 cents out of every dollar spent. And I could put up here the decade averages as well as that long run average in green, and you can see how substantially low it is. Why is that important? Because when you look at what consumers are choosing in terms of the products they are purchasing, while the overall industry is down by just a little over 1%, not the case for the kind of products that are sitting out there, right? The light truck share, which includes sport utility vehicles, pickups, as well as crossovers, that's up by nearly 6%. Passenger cars are off by double digit. So depending upon what share of the market you are producing and selling into affects the, how good each of the producers themselves are doing. So in fact, with the most recent data for June, light truck market share is at a record high level. So when you think about the automotive sector for the U.S., you should not be envisioning passenger cars. We are a truck market and have been for quite a time period. And if anything, the market share is increasing even further. And that's important when you think about, we all know about the fact that the Detroit 3 used to be the big 3, has a much smaller share of the total market being sold. But once you factor in the red share there, which is the new domestic, so the foreign nameplates that are actually manufacturing here in the United States, the current amount that's being produced here and sold here is actually higher than it was back in 1980. And in fact, much more competitive, because back in 1980, we only had 4 producers in essence. We had the big 3 plus Volkswagen. Today we have 15 different nameplate manufacturers producing in the United States, much more competitive. So the one thing you want to kind of focus on is what is happening with inventories. And inventories have risen. They are high for both passenger cars and light trucks, but guess what? It's not too much of a surprise. Probably more uncomfortable on the passenger car side. So the industry is definitely trying to make adjustments to kind of keep that in line. And you look at what's going on with regard to industrial output for vehicles, it's much lower than what we've seen. So the industry is trying to normalize their production rate. You can look at what's happening on vehicle prices. They're pretty flat. So we're not seeing significant declines as they try to discount to push product. Compare that with the period between 1999 and 2007, one some of the highest selling years in history, but those were the years where every year the industry lost money. So they're being far more controlled with regard to the market. And John mentioned about the delinquency rates. I absolutely agree with them. We're seeing those moving higher. So here is the delinquency rates for direct loans. These are the ones made by banks to consumers. They're moving higher, but as you can see from a historical perspective, still quite low. Doesn't mean that they're not going to get to a position where we have to start really worrying about it. And in fact, banks are already making adjustments. Where's John? Right, John? Yeah, don't try to get for Range Rover, he said he can get a loan, but don't try a subprime loan with them right now. And then for indirect loans, which by the way is the bulk of the loans that are out there, about 80% of the loans come from non-bank sources. That too is seeing the delinquency rates rise, but again, rising from very low levels to something that is still quite low. So question for you. How many of you out there, since we were hearing about alternative energy, so how many of you drive an all-electric vehicle? A Tesla or a Leaf? Oh, come on. We don't have a Tesla driver here? Shocking. How about a hybrid? How many hybrid drivers do we have here? Oh, my God. Well, so don't feel bad. The blue line up there, that's all of you, if you own a car. You know, the vast majority of what's being sold is still the internal combustion engine, whether diesel or electric. The green is everything else. Electric, hybrids, solar, wind, gravity if you put it on a hill and let it roll down. And maybe I'm lying to you here, right? It's a nascent sector. Maybe I'm kind of, this scale is causing you to not see the action that's happening. Well, if you put the green line on its own scale, you can see the introduction of the Prius as it began to have sales go higher. And it peaked out at 4%. That's the highest share this market has ever taken. So 96% were not these type of vehicles. And that's when fuel prices were up at the $4 to $5 per gallon price. And you could see the market. As soon as the price plummeted, it fell quite dramatically. And quite frankly, the sales that Tesla is getting, I doubt there's a single one of those buyers that bought that vehicle to save money on gasoline. In fact, I don't think their grandkids will be able to be breaking even on that vehicle if they get the chance to drive it. So the point is that right now, even today, this market is still yet to be really created. 97% of the product that is sold out there, let alone what the fleet of vehicles of 250 million vehicles represents, are not these type of products. So as we hear the stories about finding, fueling stations or electric stations, just not as many product out there, so you can understand maybe it's a bit of the chicken and the egg problem. Finally, what is expected with regard to vehicle sales? At this point, Blue Chip is kind of expecting that these are going to edge lower. I think that's reasonable. I think that we're still adding, if we're adding as many jobs as we're adding, that 2 million jobs, incomes are rising, there's going to be some support out there with the average age of vehicles at still over 11 years of age. There's going to be demand for replacement and so forth that will support a fairly high level. But when people were talking about 18 million, 19 million as a possible trend, I was very skeptical of that. But I think something in the 16 to 17 million range is certainly a reasonable thing to expect, and Blue Chip is expecting something around that midpoint for the next year or two. So that's basically what I wanted to present. I look forward to your questions. Manuel?
Thank you again. Yeah, I won't repeat the thanks to everybody, but thanks again. And I'm going to talk about something completely different, obviously. I'm waiting for the presenter to come up. I'm going to talk about the U.S. construction industry. If later you have any questions on the rest of the world construction industry, I'd love to answer them, but yeah, I'm not going to focus on it right now. Okay? Yeah. No, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So, okay, fine. I'll just summarize what I'm going to say, is that way I can go faster through the rest of the deck of the slides. Is that the construction industry in the U.S. still has a long way to go. Still has a long way to go because the residential sector, when you look at demographics or you relative to the to a past or wherever, it still hasn't reached its equilibrium, demographic equilibrium level, and in that case, we still have years ahead of us. However, it's been going up slower than anybody anticipated. I would have expected it to have reached that level already, so the fact that it didn't grow that fast in the last few years, although it was dynamic, means that it has a few more years to go. The non-residential, it depends where you look at, and the one that has been lacking for the last X years has been actually infrastructure. So it depends on the outlook you have for infrastructure plans, both at the, I would say primarily at the federal level, whether you buy that there will be a large infrastructure plan like President Trump announced or not, that will make a big difference. But it is kind of funny because the infrastructure expenditure has been so low in the last few years that you don't have to do much to add to the infrastructure that you have. Not only because you had low infrastructure spending at the federal level, but because of the state finances. For several years, you had low infrastructure expenditure at the state level and local level, which is now actually picking up somewhat. So in all those cases, it seems like the future looks okay for construction. Once that's said, one thing you have to realize is that actually the construction sector has been losing share in GDP since the 70s. It has nothing to do with the recent crisis. This is a long-term share loss. Obviously, services, other parts of the economy have been gaining ground. It's not only residential sector that has actually lost ground, but it's residential. Demographics are growing somewhat lower than they used to. But infrastructure, you haven't done a good infrastructure plan in a long time. But what is surprising that even industrial and commercial seems to have lost ground since the 70s. So the construction sector is not as important to the economy as it used to be. It's still an important driver, but not quite as much as it was. And particularly, I say it has a long way to go, because we all realize that obviously construction, particularly residential investment, was part of the reasons or what was behind the Great Recession, or one of the causes, together with the banks, of the Great Recession. But that has not corrected yet. When you realize actually the sector lost over 40% of its value added, right? The economy is back to equilibrium, actually was past the previous peak back in 2011, right? The sector is not back to what it was before the crisis began. It's going to take a while for it to be back. And that matters both for construction activity and for employment. Employment in the construction sector, or employment took somewhat longer to recuperate. Remember the first years after the recession, it was like growth without employment. We've had employment growth in the last few years, but that hasn't been the case in the construction sector, and at least not at the same pace for a while. And obviously, if construction was the key, residential was even worse, right? During the crisis, construction in residential investment dropped by 70%. It has corrected significantly since then. We're back to around 60% of what it was before the crisis, but we're still way off what it was. And when you look at where the equilibrium level was, which was around, I'll show you later, around 1,500,000 homes per annum. Some people will say 1,400,000, others will go to 1,600,000. There is a range. We're still not even close to that. And that has meant that we not only haven't we reached the equilibrium yet, but we're adding to pent-up demand. So eventually, residential construction should do relatively well. That being said, the economy is growing 2%, while residential sector is growing 7%. Still, it needs to grow well above the economy if it's ever going to pick up. Like Bill, I have some, can you see the colors there? Green is good, red is bad. You don't see much red there, right? And barely you see the very strong green in particularly anything that is related to expectations, the NFIB, or anything related to mortgages or anything. Everything looks quite good. When you look to single construction, continues to look good. And if anything, you see some yellowish, which means maybe some excesses in multifamily. Multifamily was the first part to recuperate after the crisis, to pick up. And now there might be a little bit of an excess some places, but I don't know to what extent it is an excess, or it is or to some extent it's a change in the decision making of young population that decides to live in multifamily and postpone, as you will see later, their family decisions till later and whatever, and that means higher demand for multifamily, lower demand for single family, at least for a extended period of time. This is what we expected. I'll go into each one of them. Looking at housing, this is what we expected a little while back. I expected what is it? I don't know whether you can see it well. I can barely see it here. But what we expected is actually the economy, or the housing construction, housing starts would be back to pre-recession levels by 2016, 2015, 2016. That hasn't happened. Every year, we've had negative surprises. So obviously, well, we're economists. We tweak our models, we recalibrate our models, put more new information into the model, and see what happens. And with the new information, what you get is actually that you are not going to reach that equilibrium level of around 1,500,000 homes till year 2018, 2019. So you're still going to be growing nice and steadily, but it's just that. It's very nice, steady growth, but nothing to write home about. Still growing above the economy. Why is that? I think there are different reasons. There are reasons in the demand side and also on the supply side. The first one on the demand side is that actually growth has been lower than anybody expected. We've been growing at a 2% economy, and every year you look at any type of forecast from almost anybody, consensus forecast, blue chip, whatever, expected growth rate was 3%, 3.5%. And I remember every year we had the bad first quarter, right? And the first quarter just dragged growth down, and we ended up 2. The following year we had another bad first quarter, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, we had 2% economy, and therefore that means that the construction sector, housing, went on with it. The second one is what I call whether the American youth is Spanishizing. I'm a Spaniard. What does that mean? That means that kids want to live off their parents until they can live off their kids. In other words, they stay home, right? In Spain, kids stay home literally till they're 40, right? It's not that much here, but you're getting there, right? So in that context, you're postponing these decisions of purchasing homes, and making a family, and that obviously shows in the housing market. The other one is shortages. We have significant shortages, particularly in the labor market, which are preventing faster construction. And that has given rise to several factors. The first one is you probably have pent-up demand. So if you had the financing and the labor and whatever, there is enough demand there for housing, at least by demographic long-term analysis, but it's not happening. You're running out of homes. Inventories ever so low and getting lower, which means that eventually you have to have a pickup in housing demand. I expect it every year, and it never happens. So now it's decided, hold on, let's not expect it for next year. I'll expect it 3 years down the line, and hopefully I'll be surprised sometime. And finally, you have very loose financial conditions, which hopefully will get looser in the mortgage sector, and those who should add. I'm just going to add something on 2 of those. One is the American youth Spanishizing, what's happening to demographics, and the second on the shortages. The first one, what you see there is the population, the percentage of youth living with parents has continued to go up tremendously over the years. Everything between 18 and 34. You can say, okay, 18 and 24, they are getting more education, because of the Great Recession, they couldn't move out, and so on. Fine. But what about people between 25 and 34? Not only have they actually remained home for a long time, but they continue to do so, right? In the age between 25 and 24, since the 70s, 26 points are down people who live with their spouse or live with a significant other. Right? Nowadays, actually 40% people of those who have gotten married. So people have postponed their marriage decision, and marriages have come down 40%. It is true that of those, there's a 15% increase in the people who live with their partner, and therefore, for housing purposes, I kind of don't care, right? But normally it's more stable when you have a marriage, but in any case, you have a very much lower. And you have a very large increase in people who are living with family or other family members, not necessarily their parents, but other family members, which means sisters, brothers, uncles, grandparents. So in other words, I wouldn't expect it to be a structural. I would expect as the economy goes on and whatever to get better, but that hasn't been the case. As a matter of fact, if we were to return these numbers and these dynamics were to go back to the 2000 to 2003 levels, that means that we would need another 3.5 to 4 million homes in the US to house all these people, right? How about shortages? The first one, I think, and I think Dunk might talk about it a little bit, the first one is there is not enough labor, there's not enough workers in the construction sector. I don't know how many of you work in the construction sector, but it doesn't matter who you talk to. Any type of, driver, painter, any type of anything that requires any type of human capital in the construction sector, you don't find enough workers. Some of them were moved into the oil industry, in particular in Texas and the oil states for a while, but when the oil industry came down, they moved only some of them moved into the construction sector, and now they're moving back again. So you have a shortage in labor, and therefore you cannot build more, even if you wanted to. And the second is you have a shortage of vacant homes. So not only do you have a shortage of workers, but you don't have enough vacant homes, so people cannot buy new homes. What does that mean? That means prices are going up, right? And regardless of what you do, and the financial sector, the banking sector is actually trying to restrict somehow. They're being more cautious about giving credit than they used to be, right? But still, you still have an increase in prices, which is several points above inflation every year. It's come down somewhat from 2 or 3 years ago when it reached double digits, but still in the 5 to 7% range increase every year. And the main reason for that is actually because you don't have enough supply, right? How about construction in the non-residential sector? I'll just say a couple of things here. First, it fell less during the recession, and it picked up earlier, and in that context, it's doing better, and it's still growing around 5%, right? But when you look at it now, it's already moderating its pace, and there are some red points, more yellows in the picture. Why? Particularly in the commercial real estate front. For commercial real estate, and we know that already, that it's been mentioned from Chairman Yellen to almost everybody, is beginning to be a source of concern. And that's going to continue to be in effect. When you look at, one of the things when I began working in the building materials industry, one thing I didn't realize, I always thought that prices adjusted more than quantities, right? That's the first thing you learn in economics, right? Prices are flexible, quantities are sticky, so when there's a crisis, quantities adjust much less than prices. That's not the case in the real estate sector, or it doesn't matter whether it's commercial or non-commercial. You can see it here. In both cases, you have activity contracting much more than prices. And that's because there are small companies that go out of business with all their business, and that allows prices to not go down as much, right? But what you can see here in the real estate sector, in the commercial real estate, is that actually prices are already above the peak from the previous boom, right? While in spite of the rise in prices on home prices, they're still well below prices from the previous boom. That's one of the sources of concern. And when you look at bank loans in the residential sector, they're still coming down, while that's not the case in the non-residential. Actually, in non-residential, they bottom out around 2011, and they've been going up since. So about financing, prices, everything is going up higher, particularly in the commercial real estate, and that's one of the sources of concern. The last part I want to talk about very quickly is infrastructure. If you look at the picture, I love this picture because it just tells you the whole story, right? You have the Great Recession, and just prior to recession, infrastructure spending peaked. But it's been below that forever. And while non-residential housing dropped very rapidly after the recession, then picked up, that didn't happen to infrastructure. Infrastructure tends to be much more stable. It's government finance and whatever. But it dropped, and it has remained at those levels since. The pickup in economic activity, the better financing by the states or local, or even the federal state, hasn't reflected in more infrastructure expenditure. We get new plans, infrastructure plans obviously every 4 years, every time you have a general election, but every X years you get a new plan, and the problem is that at the end of the day, it's not a priority. It's all talk, right? And when you look at the indicators, as I showed you before, here you see a lot of red. Right? It doesn't matter where you look at highways and streets, total, or different parts. If you go niche looking, you will find some parts of infrastructure expenditure in other buildings, or in some cases in water sewage or whatever, where there's some growth. In general, there is none. Why? Infrastructure is not a priority. It's only a priority on paper. And the second is it seems to be getting some traction now. President Trump put a lot of eggs on that basket, said he was going to do it. We haven't heard a lot from him since about it. But it seems that something might come through, and particularly because the U.S. is in need of some infrastructure expenditure. The last infrastructure push was already, half a century ago almost. No, actually over half a century ago. And you need some new infrastructures. And in that case, just one single thing. The problem is always the same, is where does the money for infrastructure come from? It's not from the federal government. You just see what they're spending on their priorities are clear. It doesn't matter what you say, at the end it's what you do. And what you're doing is that, and this is nothing that has to do for the last 5 years or the last 10 years. It's a trend that comes all the way here in the graph. You see it from the 1980s. Right? There's an increase in expenditure, a decrease in investment, and an increase in current expenditures for, for whatever reason you want. I won't get into that. But that clearly shows you what the priorities of the government are, which is, it shows in the numbers. If a plan were to come into place to the extent that Mr. Trump mentioned, it would be very positive for construction, obviously. How positive? It depends how much of the plan you believe. Right? He talked about $1 trillion. Let's cut that in half. And that depends a lot on what the states do. Usually when you have a strong federal plan, what states do is they spend less because the federal government is going to spend for them, right? And so depending on the assumptions on the cannibalization rate by the states or how much crowd in, because the plan by President Trump, needs a lot of private money to come into construction, which, let me tell you, in the US hasn't worked that well for the last couple of decades, right? Depending on what you assume for that, that's going to give you somewhere that could go another growth in construction by another point, and almost 2 points per annum from here on. If you look at the building materials where I work, actually it's more than double that, because most of that is highways and streets, and that means that you could grow just a plan like that with that 7% per annum to the growth that you already have in your basis scenario. So it is a very strong plan if it were to happen. The problem are political issues. It's too ambitious. If we get half of what's promised, that would be fine, right? But at the end of the day, I think the hardest part is really getting the private investors into an infrastructure plan, because in order to that, you're all investors. You need guarantees, right, that you're going to get your money back. And when you're talking infrastructure, you're talking 40 years. So the question is how you monetize that, right, and how you're going to do it. It's been done before elsewhere, so it's not impossible, but it takes a lot more planning that has been done here. So at the end of the day, what we have for the next 5 years, I like to end my presentation with what our forecasts for whatever their worth are for the next 5 years, is actually that construction might grow around 4%, which is almost double, right, what the economy is growing for the next 5 years. Thank you.
Start my timer. It's good to see everybody again. This is my 8th show, so I'm happy to be here. If you looked at my resume carefully, you'll come away to one clear conclusion: I'm old. I've dabbled in many things, mastered none, and I'll probably prove that to you over the next 15 minutes or so. But we'll have fun. I have a lot of slides, so if it's true that a picture paints 1,000 words, you're in luck. You won't hear that much from me. The pictures will all do the job. So just background for this presentation will be mostly about my work with the National Federation of Independent Business. They have about 325,000 member firms out there. How many NFIB members here? Not enough. Not enough. I'll see if I can change that before we leave. Anyway, every month we send out a questionnaire to a random sample of them and ask them how they're doing, collect a lot of financial information and a lot of expectations information, and you'll enjoy seeing what happened to us over the last 6 months when the election came out in a way that not many people were expecting. So this is my little chart. It says this is our job, to tell you where we are and which way we're going, and down the bottom it says 2 ways out and neither is desirable. there's just no easy way to solve the problems that we have. I think a lot of them are related to debt and, of course, all the pension stuff and everything. And we're going to have to just disabuse a lot of people of, you know, you're not going to get what we said you're going to get. I'm not going to pay my loan back, right? All those bad things are going to happen. It's just going to be very difficult. There's just no easy way. Politicians, of course, don't like that. They don't like bad outcomes. They like to have everybody win, and there are no win-win deals here. This is your caveat. Says we should have known better than to ask economists for directions. So you're seeing, this is our panel right there. And now we probably all pretty much agree now. Just a quick look at the past. I'd like to kind of compare the last big expansion we had, which was 1983 to 1990, to the current recovery. These data go through the end of last year. And I'll just point out two numbers on there rather than trying to explain all the bars to you. GDP growth in the 1983 expansion was about 4.5% a year. That was the average, compared to the 2.1% that we had. How about job creation? Well, about 800, if I can read my number there, what is that? 690,000. There we go, 690,000 jobs a quarter compared to 438,000 jobs a quarter in the last recovery. Of course, we're still generating jobs, but they're very, now remember that in 1983 we had a much smaller economy, all right? It wasn't, the labor force was a lot smaller and so on. So I think the big issue is that economic policies were a lot different. One of the big things that distinguishes these two. This is just a report on GDP growth during expansions, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. You can see the trend is not good. There are a lot of reasons behind it. One that I worry about, I wrote in the upper right-hand corner there, says government. Government has got more and more control over the allocation of resources in this economy, and it just wastes so much of our money and our time. It's just amazing. So, but I won't spend a lot of time on that. But we had an election. There it is. And people were unhappy. And so we changed the management team, much to everybody's surprise. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and then got up in the morning and asked Google who the president was, or Siri. I said, Siri, who's president? And then I thought, oh, broken. didn't have the right answer. But this is from the University of Michigan. It was a couple months ago when they did this, but they asked people about their views about where the economy is going to go over the next 6 months to a year. And it broke the numbers down by their own, the respondents' identification of what their political party is. And you can see the Republicans think that we're just going to really surge and everything's going to be great. The Democrats think we are going to have a depression. And as usual, everybody else is in the middle. But there's a huge dichotomy out there about where we think things are going to go and why we think they should go. But it's really, we've almost never seen this kind of a divisiveness by party in the past. So it'll be interesting to keep watching the Michigan stuff. How did the small businesses vote? Well, this is a poll that we take every 3 years, and we took it late last year. We send out 75 items for people to rank from worst problem down to least worst problem, but there are obviously 75 problems. And here they are. You can see rising healthcare costs is number one. That's been there since Volcker took us to number one with credit costs and availability back then. Okay, so that's number one for a long time. The cost of regulation and red tape, complying with all this stuff, number two on the list. And of course, number three is taxes, and then there are a lot more taxes down there. So tax reform is just really very important. The interesting thing for me is that we've been doing this every 3 years for a long time. First time what I think is a real business problem, that you would just expect run into doing business, finally appeared at number 10. Finding qualified workers finally appeared. And it's not government-related stuff. I hope the government doesn't try to solve that problem, but we'll worry about it. So why small business? Well, just real quickly, 90% of all the employer firms in the U.S. Have fewer than 20 employees. 99.7% have fewer than 500. How many of you have more than 500? One. Okay. You're a very small percentage of the group. Okay. This other group, other than you, the rest of the people in this room, produce half of the private GDP and employ over half of the private sector workforce historically. And produce about 2/3 of the new jobs. Now you say, how can you be half and then produce 2/3? And the answer is we fail a lot. So that happens. I mean, Bill Gates wasn't the only one trying to develop an operating system for a computer. There were lots of people doing it, training lots of workers, providing lots of income, most of them didn't make it, and those people are all working someplace else, and that's great. But that's what small businesses do. It's the R&D for the economy. It's where the new ideas are tried. When they succeed, we all reward them. When they don't succeed and they fail, we don't lose them. You still have the same people. You have the building, you have whatever. So if you had a Chinese restaurant and you failed, that didn't work, you could reopen as a French restaurant. Same chef, same table covers and everything. But you do this until you make money. That's your sign that you're doing the right thing with the resources, right? Oh, let's see here. I pushed the wrong button. All right, so this is kind of fun. This is the Small Business Optimism Index that we started collecting 43 years ago. And you can see there was a very sharp change in November and December last year. You can see the spike here. It's huge. It's comparable to what we had in 2003, but also back in 1983. You can see we had a great spike in optimism there. And you can also see that through this whole recovery period, it was terrible. The average of this index is 98 for over the 43 years, and we never reached it in this current recovery or this last recovery, whatever we want to call this. So we were below average recovery. Now again, this is half of private GDP, and this is what's happening. So you can see it's been a very, very tough period. It's kind of fun to look at these numbers just in a little bit of details. There are 10 components to the index, all kind of forward-looking and so on. And the fun thing you can notice is that in October the index was 95, which is 3 points below the average. And then in the days before the election announcement, it was 95. And then in the days after, it was 100.4, so that was a major jump. The average for November between those two numbers was 98. And then you can see what happened after that. 106, 106, 105, 105. And we just, the day before yesterday, gave the most recent monthly release, which was 103.6, I think, or something like that. But so the June number rounded up to 104. So you can see that small business owners are really optimistic about what's going on. The reason I highlighted the yellow stuff is, though, that for the most part, it's expectations. It's expect real sales, expect better business, expect. Not I'm making capital outlays, I'm hiring a lot of people. Although the job hiring numbers, the job creation numbers did turn out pretty well. But there's a lot of expectation in here. And of course, I think it's going to count. Whether it continues will depend on whether Congress makes any progress in delivering things that deal with those problems that we had on the list. Right? Those are the top problems. So these we'll go through quickly. It's just fun to look at the spike and compare it. The dotted line goes through the most recent value, which would be the June value, and you can just see where this is historically. And of course, I'd like to think all this gets translated into spending and hiring, but we'll have to see. So I'll go through. Here's now a good time to expand your business. Well, you can see forever it was not. Nobody thought it was a good time to expand their business, and now, boom. Well, why? Well, because they think there's going to be tax reform, and they're going to have the healthcare thing fixed, and we're going to get regulatory relief and all right? But if this isn't delivered, we're going to lose this. Those who said it was a bad time to expand, we asked why. The typical answer was, well, because my sales are low, the economy's weak. But the second most frequent answer we got was political climate. It's the second most frequently cited reason for why it was a bad time to expand your business. So that's down to kind of where it used to run, but it's really amazing how important the politics have become. How about sales? Well, you can first of all see, who really suffered in the recession. So this is quarter on quarter, your sales volume higher or lower than the prior quarter. And you can see it's picked up a little bit now, but you can see the Great Recession there. And of course, it looks a lot worse than what we had back in 1983. How about earnings trends? Well, I don't know why earnings would suddenly pop up like that, but we have more people reporting that their earnings are looking better, and that's good. Maybe they just start cheating on their taxes now, thinking they get a better break under the new administration. I don't know. How about quickly looking at credit markets and inflation, which is important for Janet. Let's see what happens here. Well, this is kind of a good trend. We asked them if they are collecting their receivables more quickly, are they paying their bills more quickly, And how about trade credit? Is it more available or less available? And you can see the right-hand side, everything's kind of tipped up, so it's good to see. And it's been a great improvement over the recovery period from the terrible numbers over on the left-hand side. So it's getting better, and the trend, I think, is what we'd like to see happening there. We asked about credit problems. We said last time you went to get a loan, was it easier or harder to get than the time before? You can see that there was a period of time that we complained. Nothing like when Volcker was there, at least in terms of the severity, but we're now back down to ranges where we would consider pretty typical. Regular borrowing activity, do you access your capital markets, whether it's a credit card or a line of credit or whatever, at least once a quarter, and you can see that's peaked when the prime was at 21. We loved paying 21 plus 3. And now, of course, borrowing activity is at a very, very low level. We ask, not unfortunately going back to 74, we didn't ask it, but sorry, in 1903, if all your credit needs were met, and we see that now only about 3 or 4% say no, and there's always people who think they don't get all the credit they deserve, right? The bad part of that question is the people who at the end say, I have no interest in a loan. So you can see we had a dramatic shift in the percent of owners who said, who wants a loan? What would I do with the money? Yeah, it's cheap, but look at my outlook for where the economy is going to go and the things I'm concerned about. What would I do with the money to earn a good enough return so I can pay the bank back? And banks, tend to be that way about loans. So, and I was really surprised actually to see the June numbers shoot up there. We'll have to see if that holds. So I would expect this to be coming down as firms have more and more optimism about the future, therefore willing to invest and have to borrow money from the banks to finance that investment. So one of the interesting questions we ask every time is, what's the single most important problem facing your business today? You can only pick one thing. Inflation is the all-time winner. That's the red line. The blue line is Volcker. See him there. And then, of course, if you follow the blue line, you'll see that there was really no concern about credit during the Great Recession. Why? Well, because you can only pick one thing, and the thing they really picked that time was weak sales. So you can't, if you pick weak sales, you can't say credit. I'm sure, as you saw some earlier graphs, credit was more of a problem. The other interesting peak there is the inflation concern, and of course, if you look at that, it's January of 08, and oil was like 120 a barrel, somewhere around in there, and so we were worried. What? 147. So anyway, so if you track that down, January, April, July and October. Okay, means I'm not talking fast enough. My pictures aren't getting the job done. All right, so we'll move this right along. Anyway, it's kind of interesting to see the average rate paid on short-term loans. You can see it, and went from 20 down to about 5, where it is today. I'll make this chart. We asked them last time we got loans, the interest rate higher or lower. You can see markets doing their job. Prices are moving, higher, lower prices, voila. And then all of a sudden the Fed takes over, and it flatlines. The markets are not allowing, or the Fed's not allowing interest rates to do the job they're supposed to do, which is to allocate credit, and that's one of the problems we had. Actual price increases, where you can see we did raise as many as 70% of our people back in the day were raising prices. Now we're down here. Again, you see that spike in January of 08. I should have said that these are quarterly numbers except for the blue dust. Quarterly is the January survey, the April, July, and October, where we do 2,000 observations. In between we do 600, so June and May or smaller. Okay, how about compensation? We talked about the red line is the percent of our owners who say they are raising worker comp. I don't know if it's benefits or wages. I wasn't smart enough when I designed the questionnaire a long time ago to separate those two. But you can see comp is going up. And you can also see for the blue line, which is the percent of firms raising prices, we're not passing it on in the form of higher prices. So the inflation that Janet wants is not happening. And we can deliver it. You saw it in our history. We know how to do it. But quickly looking at the employment side, percent of firms with a job opening that can fill is at record levels. And if you look at it by industry, it's almost 50% in construction. It's about 45%, 40 to 45% in manufacturing. Financial services is really high, and professional services are really high. We need people, and we can't find people. Now, we thought that's really strange because we're not tech firms. We're like little restaurants and little, right, lots of us. So we did a survey 10 years ago, and I think we released it this week, but, so you might be getting an early picture here. and I'll put my glasses on so I can see. So we asked them, what's the typical reason why somebody is disqualified for your job opening? And you can see, no surprise, the lacking of a specific skill, that's the most likely thing. And again, you can have all these charts, so be my guest. Work history, not a good work history, is pretty high there. But look, social skills, unreasonable wage expectations, appearance, attitude, those are the things that are disqualifying people. So these are things that the applicants can fix without going back to school or getting any training. If they want a job, they can get them. And so we got to wonder why they want this. But they're still living at home. That's the deal. So they don't really want a job, but maybe they have to look for a job because they have to qualify for all the benefits you can get, on welfare. But I'll let you worry about that. Job creation plans. Do you plan to increase or decrease the total number of people working for you? Well, you can see how bad that got and how good that is now. So we're planning to grow. That's really good. Just back to the most important problem, you can see it's not labor cost, it's labor quality. Now 2000 was the all-time, when we employed 64.5% of the adult population. We had a hard time finding labor. But look where it is now. It's up there. It's a problem. Average change in employment per firm. We asked them, did they increase or decrease employment, how many people, and you created an average. And we were doing pretty well there until the June survey, and it went right down to kind of zero. So I hope that that's not true, but we'll have to find out and take another survey. I'll skip that one. We can predict the unemployment rate with our numbers, so I'll skip that and not worry about that. I'll skip that one. Okay, capital spending. How much could you afford to pay one of these guys per hour? And the answer is not very much, because look at the capital equipment. How much can they move with that equipment? So if one of these guys goes to Sylvia's bank and gets a loan and buys a snowplow, that person can make a lot of money because they'd be very productive. And that's really a key. So just the investments small businesses make in raising worker productivity are important. So here's the percent of our owners who say that they made a capital outlay in the 6 months prior to the survey. Look at that peak. What was that peak from? What caused that peak? Y2K. Yep. We all went out and bought new equipment, right? Stuff that had the right kind of a chip in it. Okay, you can see then we crashed, and we've been coming back, but not very impressively. So the reports of actual spending are pretty weak, and that squares up with the national numbers that we have. How about planned outlays? Ooh. This is now, you got to really believe in the future. Yeah, I'm really optimistic, but am I going to spend money? Not yet. I have to see more. Inventory investment plans, they're kind of weak, but they've been trending up, so that looks a little bit better there on that side. So just a quick few comments on debt. I think that I really worry about debt. This is the consumer debt. The green line is what the Fed reports. The red line is what we would have if we kept our debt-to-income ratio the same as it was in '99. As GDP grew, we just kept the ratio the same, and that would be more sensible than where we were. This is what the Fed says our net worth is. Hello? Do you believe that? You feel that? I don't. I look at net worth as a claim on output. You can sell your Apple stock and buy these cars out here, so you can convert. And so I said, let's look at the ratio of net worth to GDP, which is the measure of stuff we make, stuff like cars. What does that look like? And you can see the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, and you can see where we are now. And I just say, that's bubble trouble. There's stock and bond indices there. So I worry that bad things are going to happen to adjust this, and this is what we're going to see. So finally, in 30, I like this. She says, well, I'm not about to stand around idly. When my country needs me the most, she's going to go shopping, and she's got John Sylvia's credit card there and be good. Okay, just a few jokes here. Okay, this is, I entitled this, I said, the Dems swing for the fence and strike, and you can see where the ball hit there. I put an arrow in. This is the crime map in the U.S. and the voting map, and I'll let you decide which one is which, because they look about the same. This is what the election would look like without the Electoral College. That's where your big states are. I like this. It says I can't read that without my glasses. I kind of know what it says, but I'll just quickly will look at it. All right, it says, 2/3 of Trump's wives are immigrants, proving once again we need immigrants to take jobs Americans won't take. How about this? There you go. Okay, this is called The Vet, the Dog Caught the Car. Of course, the car is Obamacare. And guess what? We haven't been able to get the wreckage off of the poor GOP. They're still there. This is, of course, walking away from it, not a scratch. The Democrat Party. My warning always, of course, is trickle down. We're down at the bottom, the politicians are in the top. This is what we're going to do. We're going to raise taxes, I'm sure, one way. So it says if you have to choose between drinking wine every day or being skinny, which would you choose? Would that be red or white? And always find ways to percent average? No. There are a lot of reasons we won't discuss about why that's the case now, but we could do a lot better than we're doing now with the right set of policies. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.